The first snow came early that October, soft and forgiving, dusting the high meadows like flour on a baker's hands. Elira Thorne stood at the edge of what remained of the old settlement, stone foundations rising from the earth like broken teeth, walls that had once held families through winters no one alive could remember. Her dog, a gray-muzzled shepherd named Colt, pressed his shoulder against her leg, the way he always did when she went too quiet for too long. She had been climbing for 3 days to reach this place. 3 days of switchbacks and false summits, of streams that had to be forded and deadfall that had to be climbed over or crawled under. Her pack weighed 40 pounds. Her legs ached with the particular exhaustion that comes from altitude, the kind that settles into the bones and doesn't leave until you descend. But she wasn't going to descend. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The map in her coat pocket was hand-drawn, creased from years of folding and unfolding. The ink faded to a color that matched the autumn sky. Her grandmother had made it. Her grandmother had never explained why. She had simply pressed it into Elira's hands on her deathbed, her fingers cold and trembling, and whispered 2 words that Elira had spent 15 years trying to forget. Just bones, Elira whispered now, looking at the ruins. That's all that's left. But Colt's ears had gone forward. He was watching something she couldn't see or wouldn't. Dogs knew things. That was what her grandmother always said. They feel the shape of what used to be. They hear the echoes we've trained ourselves to ignore. The settlement had no name on any official survey. The Forest Service maps showed only contour lines and a seasonal creek that ran dry by August. The nearest marked trail was 11 miles to the east, and even that trail saw fewer than 100 hikers per year, serious backcountry travelers who knew better than to wander off route into terrain that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. But her grandmother's map marked this place with a small X and 2 words written in her careful hand: "Come home." Elira had spent 15 years not understanding those words. She had spent 15 years building a life in the lowlands, a job in an office with fluorescent lights and recycled air, a marriage to a man who was kind but distant, a house with central heating and neighbors close enough to hear through the walls, normal things, safe things, the things you were supposed to want. Then her husband left. Not for another woman, not in anger, just a quiet admission one evening that he had never really known her, that she had never really let him, that whatever wall she had built around herself was too high for him to climb. He wasn't wrong. She hadn't argued. Then the job ended. Budget cuts, they said. Last hired, first fired. She had nodded and cleaned out her desk and felt nothing at all. Then the house stopped feeling like anything but walls, and one night, unable to sleep, she had pulled her grandmother's old trunk from the closet and found the map folded inside a leather journal she had never opened. The journal told a story she wasn't ready to believe. The map led somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. But here she was, and the ruins were real. The largest remaining structure stood at the settlement's western edge, where the mountain began its final climb toward the granite peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. 3 walls remained, 2 standing nearly full height at perhaps 8 feet. The third collapsed to a ragged line of stone barely reaching her hip. The 4th wall was gone entirely, leaving an opening that faced south toward the distant valley, where the last light of day was painting the aspens gold and red. Elira walked the perimeter slowly, her boots crunching on frost-hardened grass. The stonework was remarkable, fitted blocks of gray granite chinked with a mortar mixture that had somehow survived decades of freeze and thaw, of snow load and spring runoff, and the relentless pressure of roots seeking purchase in every crack. Whoever built this had understood the mountain, had known that cold came from the north and the northwest, that the south-facing opening would catch whatever winter sun made it through the clouds, that thick walls held heat the way thin ones never could. She ran her fingers along the stone and felt something she couldn't name, a resonance, a rightness, as if the walls were waiting for something they had been promised long ago. Colt sniffed at the foundation, his nose working the ground where a century of wind and weather had buried whatever secrets remained. Then he looked up at her with something like recognition, the same look he gave when they returned to places they had been before, even places they had only visited once. "I know," she said. "I feel it too." The journal entries had been sparse, more suggestion than explanation. Her grandmother had written about a woman who lived in these mountains before the war, before any war that Alara's history books bothered to name. A woman who had built something here, who had stayed when everyone else left, who had reasons for staying that were never fully explained. She understood the stone her grandmother had written in handwriting that grew shakier toward the end of the journal as her illness took hold. The way it breathes, the way it remembers. She said the mountains keep what we give them, and she gave them everything she had. Alara had dismissed it as poetry, old woman sentimentality about a place that probably never existed the way memory claimed it did, the kind of story families tell themselves to make their history feel more meaningful than it really was. But standing here now, with Colt pressed warm against her leg and the wind dying to a whisper as it passed through the ancient walls, she wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure of anything. She made camp that first night inside the three-walled structure. Her small tent pitched in the corner where two walls met at their full height. The wind that had followed her up the mountain, that constant, keening presence that had been her companion for 3 days, couldn't reach her here. The cold that had numbed her fingers during the climb seemed muted, softened by stone that had been absorbing the day's thin sunlight for hours, and was now releasing that warmth slowly into the sheltered space. It shouldn't have surprised her. She had read enough about thermal mass to understand the principle, the way dense materials absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back through the night, buffering temperature swings that would otherwise make high-altitude living unbearable. But reading about it and feeling it were different things. The warmth wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A few degrees, maybe. But in the mountains, a few degrees was the difference between comfort and suffering. Sometimes it was the difference between life and death. Her grandmother's journal lay open beside her sleeping bag, the pages illuminated by her headlamp's glow. She had read these entries a dozen times during the climb, but something about reading them here, in the place they described, made them feel different, more real, more urgent. Her name was Maren Holt, the entry read. She came to the mountains in 1891, the year the Great Cold killed half the cattle in the territory. Everyone said she was running from something. Perhaps she was. But she was also running toward something. A way of living that the lowlands could never offer. A silence that had weight and meaning. A solitude that wasn't loneliness, but something else entirely. Something most people never learn to tell apart. Colt rested his chin on Alara's thigh, his eyes half closed but watchful. He had been with her for 11 years now, longer than her marriage, longer than most of the friendships she had let slip away. He was the only creature alive who knew all her silences, the only one who had never asked her to explain them. She scratched behind his ears and turned the page. Maren built her cabin against the old walls. The settlement had been abandoned for decades by the time she arrived. Some fever had swept through, they said, though no one could say for certain what kind, or whether fever was even the right word. The people who survived had left for the valley. The people who didn't survive were buried in a meadow, half a mile to the east. Their graves unmarked now, swallowed by wildflowers and time. She didn't fear the ghosts. She said they were good company, better than most living people she'd known. The wind shifted outside, moaning through gaps in the collapsed wall. Alara pulled her sleeping bag tighter and kept reading. The cabin was small, 10 by 12 feet, no more. But she designed it to work with the stone rather than against it. The ancient walls became her north and west protection, their mass absorbing heat from her small stove and releasing it through the long mountain nights. She cut no windows on the exposed sides. Her single opening faced south, fitted with oiled paper that let in light while holding back the worst of the cold. They called her the Stone Woman, the Hermit, the Witch in the Walls. She let them call her whatever they wanted. Names were just sounds people made when they didn't understand something. She had found what they couldn't understand, a way to be warm when the rest of the mountain was freezing, a way to survive on half the firewood the valley ranchers burned, a way to make the land provide rather than simply endure. Alara set the journal down and stared at the stone wall rising beside her tent. In the darkness, she could almost see it. A small cabin tucked against this ancient structure, smoke rising from a pipe near the ridge, a woman standing at the south-facing opening watching the snow fall. A woman who had chosen this, who had stayed. She could almost feel the warmth that woman had felt, the warmth of walls that held what they were given. Morning came gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow before nightfall. Alara built a small fire in the shelter of the walls and made coffee while Colt explored the perimeter, his nose working the ground where 100 years of wind and weather had buried whatever secrets remained. She had come here to find something. She wasn't sure what. Closure, maybe. Or answers. Or just proof that her grandmother's stories were more than the wanderings of a dying mind. The journal offered possibilities. Her grandmother had written about letters, correspondence between Maren Holt and someone in the valley, someone who had cared enough to keep the connection alive despite the isolation, despite the difficulty of reaching this place, despite all the reasons most people would have let the connection die. Those letters had supposedly been preserved, hidden somewhere in the ruins against the day when someone might come looking. If you find this place, her grandmother had written in an entry dated just weeks before her death, look for the stone that doesn't belong. Maren always said the mountains were built from one kind of rock, but her cabin was built from two. The difference matters. It always matters. Alara spent the morning examining the walls, running her fingers over blocks of granite that had stood for longer than anyone could remember. The work was remarkable, fitted so tightly that a knife blade couldn't slip between the stones, chinked with a mortar that had the color and texture of the earth itself. Whoever had built this understood not just construction, but permanence. They had built to last through centuries, not decades. But near the base of the western wall, where the stone met the ground at its lowest point, she found something different. A single block of sandstone, reddish-brown against the gray granite, cut to the same size as the others, but clearly from somewhere else, carried here from the lowlands, perhaps, or salvaged from some structure that had served a different purpose in a different time. the stone that doesn't belong. Colt came to stand beside her as she knelt in the frost-hardened grass. He whined softly, sensing her excitement, or her fear. She wasn't sure which. Maybe both. Maybe they were the same thing in moments like this. The block was loose, not mortared like the others, but simply set in place, held by gravity and the weight of the stones above. Ilara worked her fingers around the edges, feeling for purchase, her heart beating faster than it should. Then she pulled. It came free with a grinding sound that echoed off the ancient walls. Behind it was darkness, a hollow space where the wall should have been solid, and inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry for a century, were papers. The letters numbered 47. Each one was dated, the earliest from September 1892, the latest from December 1919. The handwriting was small and precise, the ink faded but still legible after all these years, testimony to the quality of the paper, the care of the writer, and the protection of the oilcloth that had preserved them against moisture and time. Ilara spread them on the floor of her tent, her hands trembling as she arranged them in order. Colt lay beside her, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, watching her with eyes that seemed to understand the magnitude of what she had found. The first letter was from someone named Catherine, a sister, Ilara realized as she read. Marin's younger sister, who had stayed in the valley when Marin climbed to the mountains. Dearest Marin, the valley talks about you. They say you've gone mad, living alone up there with nothing but ghosts and stone. They say the winter will kill you, that no woman can survive what the mountains demand. I tell them they don't know you. I tell them you were never afraid of being alone. You were afraid of being trapped. Those are different fears, and only one of them kills slowly. Mother asks about you every day. She doesn't understand why you left. I tell her you found something worth staying for. She doesn't understand that either. But I think I do. I think I've always understood, even when I couldn't put words to it. Write when you can. The road will freeze soon, and then nothing will move until spring. Your loving sister, Catherine Ilara, read the letters one by one, watching a life unfold in fragments. Winters survived, springs celebrated, summers of preparation, and autumns of harvest. Marin had lived in these mountains for nearly 30 years, through wars and fevers and cold snaps that killed people in houses far more substantial than her stone-sheltered cabin. And she had thrived, not just survived, thrived. The letters spoke of gardens that grew in soil she enriched herself, of root cellars dug into the mountain's slope, of friendships with traders and trappers and a Ute elder who visited each summer and taught her things the valley people had never learned. The secret, Marin wrote in one letter dated January 1908, is not fighting the mountain. It's learning what the mountain already knows. The stone people who built these walls understood that. They didn't try to beat the cold. They worked with it. Mass absorbs heat. Shelter blocks wind. The south-facing opening catches what little sun the winter offers, and the thick walls hold that warmth through the long nights. My neighbors in the valley burn 10 cords of wood and still wake shivering. I burn 4 and sleep warm. They think I'm mad. I think they've forgotten how to listen. The letters continued through the years, chronicling Marin's life in the mountains, her knowledge of plants and weather patterns, her observations of wildlife, her growing understanding of the rhythms that governed life at altitude. She wrote about the exact angle of winter sun, the thermal properties of different types of stone, the importance of air gaps and vestibules and proper orientation. She wrote like a scientist, like someone documenting knowledge that might otherwise be lost, and woven through all of it, the references to Catherine, the sister who kept writing, the sister who kept believing, the sister who, Alara slowly realized with a shock that made her breath catch, was her great-great-grandmother. The blood that ran through Marin's veins ran through hers. The woman who had built against the stone was family. The final letter was different from the others, shorter. Written in a hand that shook slightly, the words spaced unevenly across the page, as if the writer's strength was failing but her determination remained. Dearest Catherine, I am old now. Older than I expected to become. The winters feel longer, and the climbs that once seemed easy now leave me breathless in ways that have nothing to do with the altitude. But I am not afraid. I have lived the life I chose, the only life I could have lived and still been myself. I have built something that will outlast me, not the cabin, which will fall when I am gone, but the knowledge, the understanding of how to work with this place instead of against it. I have written it all down. The measurements and orientations, the principles of thermal mass and wind protection, the techniques the stone people knew, and the valley people forgot. It is hidden where you will know to look. If you ever come, if you ever climb this high, if you ever need what I learned, tell your children, tell their children. Someone, someday, will need what I found here. Someone will come to these mountains looking for something they lost in the lowlands, something they didn't know they were missing until the silence showed them where to look. When they do, I want them to find more than ruins. I want them to find a way to stay. All my love, always, Marin Alara sat in the growing darkness, the letter trembling in her hands. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and steady, dusting the ancient walls with white. Colt pressed closer, his warmth a comfort she hadn't known she needed, his breath slow and even against her leg. Her grandmother had found these letters, had read them, had kept them secret for reasons Alara might never fully understand, had drawn the map that led here, and written the two words that had haunted Alara through all the years of trying to build a life that felt like someone else's. Come home, not to a place, not really, to a way of living, to a tradition of women who chose the difficult path because the easy one would have cost them something they couldn't afford to lose, to knowledge that had been waiting, patient as stone, for someone who was ready to receive it. Alara folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. The snow was falling harder now, but the walls held. The warmth remained. And somewhere in the silence, she could feel something shifting, not in the mountain, but in herself. She stayed through the winter. It wasn't a decision she made consciously, not at first. She simply stayed another day, then another after that. She rationed her supplies and supplemented them with knowledge from Marin's letters, which plants could be gathered even in cold weather, where the spring-fed pools stayed unfrozen, how to set snares for rabbits in the manner the Ute elder had taught. She used Marin's techniques to build a small shelter against the ancient walls, following the principles laid out in the letters and in the journal her grandmother had kept. Thick walls, facing north, constructed from stones she gathered and fitted by hand. A south-facing opening covered with plastic sheeting that let in light while holding back the cold. A wood stove she had carried up in pieces, its pipe extending through a carefully fitted hole near the ridge of her makeshift roof. The valley people would have said she was mad. The same words they had used for Marin 100 years ago. the same words people always used when they couldn't understand why someone would choose difficulty over comfort, solitude over company, the mountain over the valley. But Alara had stopped caring what the valley people said. She had spent her whole life caring, and it had brought her nothing but walls that felt like prisons, and relationships that felt like performances. Up here, there was no one to perform for, no one to explain herself to, just the wind and the stone and the slow rhythm of days that asked nothing of her, except attention. Colt adapted to the mountain life with the ease of an animal who had always known he was meant for something other than sidewalks and fenced yards. He ranged the meadows during the day, his gray coat blending with the winter landscape, returning each evening with reports she couldn't understand but somehow felt. Movements in the tree line, changes in the weather, the presence of elk and deer and the occasional mountain lion that kept its distance from the smoke rising from her shelter. At night, he slept beside her, his warmth adding to the warmth of the stone, his breathing a rhythm that anchored her to something real when her thoughts threatened to drift too far. The cold came hard in January, temperatures dropping below zero for days at a time. The wind screamed across the exposed ridges and piled snow in drifts that reached the top of her shelter's walls, but inside, the temperature never dropped below 40. The thermal mass absorbed what little heat she generated and released it slowly through the longest nights. She burned less wood than she expected, 4 cords for the whole winter, just as Maren had written. She was warmer than she had any right to be. And she was, for the first time in years, not lonely. The solitude was different here. It had weight and meaning, just as her grandmother's journal had said. It was the solitude of someone who had chosen, not someone who had been left behind. It was the solitude of purpose, of work that mattered, of days that built toward something instead of just passing. She read Maren's letters every night by candlelight. She studied the techniques and principles. She made notes of her own, observations about what worked and what didn't, modifications she had made, questions she wished she could ask across the century that separated them. She was learning, and the learning felt like coming home. Spring came slowly to the high meadows, stubborn green pushing through the snow, birdsong returning to the bare branches, the creek running full with meltwater from the peaks above. Alara stood at the south-facing opening of her shelter and watched the world come back to life. She had survived. More than survived. She had found something she hadn't known she was looking for, a version of herself that felt true, in a way the valley version never had. A woman who could build and hunt and endure. A woman who didn't need anyone's approval to know her own worth. She had read Maren's letters so many times now that she could recite passages from memory. The practical instructions for building in the mountains. The philosophy of working with the land rather than against it. The quiet wisdom of a woman who had found a way to live that the valley people never understood. But there was one passage she returned to more than any other. A paragraph from a letter dated March 1915, written after a winter that had killed 3 families in the valley below. They say the mountain is cruel. They say it takes and never gives. But they are wrong, Catherine. The mountain gives constantly, shelter in the stone, water in the streams, warmth in the sun that reaches even these high places. We are the ones who fail to receive. We build our houses wrong and blame the cold. We ignore the lessons of the land and then act surprised when the land ignores us. I have spent 24 winters here now. I have learned that the mountain's cruelty is really just indifference, and indifference can be survived if you understand what you're dealing with. It's the valley's cruelty I could never survive, the judgment, the expectation, the constant pressure to be something other than what I am. The mountain doesn't ask me to be anyone other than who I am. It only asks that I pay attention. And paying attention, I have found, is the beginning of everything worth knowing. Ilara folded the letter back into its oilcloth wrapping and tucked it into her coat pocket. She would keep them all, she decided. Not hidden in a wall, but passed down the way they should have been passed down from the beginning. Grandmother to mother to daughter, woman to woman. Knowledge surviving through telling, through teaching, through the simple act of refusing to let important things be forgotten. Colt stood at the edge of the meadow, his tail wagging slowly as he watched a hawk circle overhead. He had gray in his muzzle now, more than when they had arrived. But he moved like a younger dog, alert, curious, alive in a way he hadn't been in the valley, like an animal who had finally found the life he was meant to live. Ilara knew the feeling. She felt it every morning when she woke to the sound of wind in the pines. She felt it every evening when she watched the sun set behind the granite peaks. She felt it now, standing in the doorway of a shelter she had built with her own hands against walls that had stood for centuries. She was home. She finally understood what the words meant. She would go back to the valley eventually. There were things she needed. Supplies for next winter. Tools for the cabin she planned to build. Perhaps news of the world she had left behind. She wasn't abandoning civilization entirely. She was just choosing which parts of it she wanted to keep. But she would return here. She would always return. The cabin she planned to build would take years, not months. Proper stonework, fitted the way the ancient builders had fitted theirs. Thick walls facing north and west, oriented to catch winter sun and block the prevailing wind. A south-facing opening with glass, real glass, not plastic sheeting, that would let in light while holding heat. A vestibule to create an airlock, just as Marin had described. All the principles her ancestor had learned and written down and hidden for someone, someday, to find. For her. It had all been waiting for her. Come home, her grandmother's map had said. She was home now. She understood what the words meant. Not a place, not really, or not just a place. A way of being, a tradition, a line of women stretching back through time, all of them choosing the difficult path, all of them finding something the easy path could never have given them. The wind was talking again, moving through the ancient walls with a sound that was almost like voices. The stone people who had built this place, the woman who had sheltered here for 30 years, the grandmother who had kept the secret and drawn the map and trusted that someone would eventually follow. Ilara listened, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she could hear what they were saying. The mountains keep what we give them. The stone holds what we build. The cold takes only what we refuse to learn. And somewhere in the silence between the wind's words, Colt pressed warm against her leg, and the sun broke through the clouds, and the world felt, finally, like exactly what it was supposed to be. She had come looking for ruins. She had found a foundation. Now, it was time to build.